The wealthiest man in Chicago lived high above the city in an office that felt more like a fortress than a workplace. Graham Locke, the cold, untouchable titan of finance, had a reputation that made 200 employees whisper the moment his polished shoes struck the marble floors. No one dared to look him in the eye. And yet, on one Tuesday morning, inside his penthouse office at the Willis Tower, the most dangerous moment of his life wasn't caused by a boardroom rival or a billion-dollar deal collapsing. It came from a 5-year-old girl holding his phone. What she whispered into that line would stop his world in its tracks. Before we dive in, let me ask you, if you saw a child pick up a call that could decide your entire fortune, would you snatch it away or wait to hear what they said? Drop your thoughts in the comments because what happens next will shock you more than any deal gone wrong. And stay with me, because what unfolds after this moment is darker, more human, and far more unexpected than anything Graham Locke ever faced. That morning, the sky over Lake Michigan glowed copper, streaking the glass walls of Graham's office. To the world below, he was the master of the board, a man who never lost a game. But inside that immaculate space, he was pacing like a caged animal waiting for one call. It was supposed to be salvation, millions of dollars from an international investor promising to stabilize his crumbling empire. The phone on his desk was no longer just a device. It was a lifeline, the thin thread keeping his legacy from vanishing. The door creaked open. Rosa Alvarez, the cleaning lady who kept his empire spotless without ever daring to meet his eyes, stepped in quietly. Beside her, hiding behind her faded uniform, was Mia, her daughter. Rosa's voice was trembling. "Mr. Locke, I had no one else." The school's pipes burst. "She'll stay quiet, I promise." Rules were rules, no outsiders were allowed, but Graham, too consumed by the storm in his head, only waved a hand. Fine. But silence. He didn't even look at the girl. Mia climbed onto a chair in the corner, her small legs dangling, her wide eyes following him. She wasn't distracted by the leather sofas or the art that cost more than her family's yearly rent. She was watching him. The tapping of his polished shoes against the floorboards, the way his jaw clenched whenever he looked at the silent phone, she noticed everything. Minutes later, the inevitable happened. Graham's assistant called him urgently to a meeting. "Sir, our largest client is threatening to pull the contract." Furious, he grabbed his briefcase and stormed out, but not before snapping to Rosa. "If anyone calls, especially a Mr. Marin, take a message. That call means everything." The door slammed behind him. Silence filled the room. The hum of the city below seemed distant. Then the phone rang. Not just any call, the name Victor Marin flashed on the screen. Rosa was in the adjacent room with the vacuum roaring. The shrill sound cut through the air, and Mia slid off the chair, eyes locked on the glowing name. She climbed onto the massive leather seat behind the desk. The phone nearly swallowed her tiny hand. She pressed it to her ear. At that very moment, Graham realized he had left his wallet. He retraced his steps and pushed the door open just an inch. He froze. He could hear her. A child's voice, steady and chilling. "Don't ever call my mom's boss again." And then click. The call ended. The air collapsed into silence. Graham stood in the doorway, blood draining from his face. His empire, his billion-dollar deal, had just been severed by a 5-year-old girl. Rosa appeared from the other room, saw her daughter in the chair, and went pale. She dropped the rag in her hand. "Mia." "What did you do, Mr. Locke, please?" She didn't mean. Her words tripped over themselves, already imagining the worst termination, eviction, ruin. But Graham's eyes were locked on the child who now turned toward him. No trace of fear, no apology, just a gaze too calm for her age. He stepped forward slowly, his voice low, dangerous. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" His breath shook as he leaned close. This wasn't just anger, it was fear that everything he had built had vanished with one click. And then Mia spoke. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it sliced through him sharper than any accusation. That man's voice, I know it. It's the same voice I heard outside our building, the night Mr. Sam lost everything. For the first time in decades, Graham Locke, master of the market, king of the skyscraper, felt his hands tremble. This was no accident. This child wasn't reckless. She was warning him, and the truth she carried would rip open a side of the business world he thought he controlled. What would you have done in Graham's place? Fire them on the spot, or listen to the words of a child Graham Locke had lived his entire life trusting the numbers. Ratios, forecasts, yield curves, those were the tools that built his empire. Yet now, standing in his office with Rosa clutching her daughter's hand like a shield, it wasn't a graph or balance sheet that shook him. It was the memory of a child's words. Mia's whisper had been so matter-of-fact, as if she had merely pointed out the color of the sky. She knew that voice. She had heard it before in a place where polished shoes never walked. Graham wanted to dismiss it as childish fantasy, but there was something about the way Mia said it, steady, deliberate, that dug under his skin. Rosa's trembling apology trailed into silence, waiting for his verdict. He could have ended it there, fired them both, locked the door, and called Victor Marin back with an excuse. But his instincts, honed over decades of boardroom warfare, screamed at him that this was no accident. He poured himself a glass of water, though his hand shook enough that some spilled onto the rim. "Explain," he said, finally, his voice low, but stripped of its usual authority. Mia looked at her mother for permission. Rosa nodded, still pale, and the little girl stepped forward. "I heard that man yesterday, when you weren't looking. His voice is like syrup poured over broken glass. He laughed, but it wasn't a happy laugh. He said something about scrap Iron Sam." She hesitated, trying to remember each word as if they were puzzle pieces. He said this plan would be just like what they did to him. The name meant nothing to Graham, but Rosa gasped softly. "Sam," she whispered. "Oh, dear Lord." Graham's eyes narrowed. "You know him." Rosa swallowed the words sticking in her throat. "Everyone in our neighborhood knows him. He ran a scrapyard. A good man, worked with his hands. Then some investors came, promised him a way to expand, make it bigger. They had papers, contracts, even a lawyer with them. He trusted them. Within weeks, it was gone. His land, his savings, even his house. They said it was all legal. He signed everything." Graham listened, and a chill crept up his spine. Rosa's story wasn't unfamiliar. He had seen headlines about small business owners swindled by slick operators, and he always thought the same thing: how naive, how foolish. That could never happen to him. He had lawyers, consultants, entire teams to prevent it. Yet here was a child connecting dots his experts hadn't. He turned sharply to his head of security, Darren Cole, who had stepped silently into the office. A former detective, Darren had the unsettling habit of appearing only when needed. "Pull the files," Graham ordered. "I want every detail of this deal with Marin. The accounts, the wiring instructions, the shells he wants us to use." Within minutes, Darren had a wall-sized screen lit up with diagrams of bank accounts and transfers. Names of shell corporations blinked in Zurich, Luxembourg, the Cayman Islands. Lines crisscrossed the map like spiderweb threads, all flowing back to one entity, Marin's holding company. Graham felt his stomach knot. At first glance, it looked like any other international transaction, but under the child's lens, it was something else. Escrow accounts replaced by direct transfers. An urgency that pressed him to move money before the weekend. Even his trusted attorney, Harold Kent, had reassured him it was standard in international finance. and Graham had nearly believed him. Mia walked closer, her small head tilting as she studied the glowing web of lines. She didn't understand corporate finance, but she recognized patterns. "It's like when my teacher draws mazes," she said. "You think it goes out, but it only goes in. You never get out." Her words landed harder than any analyst report. Rosa crossed herself, whispering a prayer. Darren's expression usually stone-shifted. He tapped one company name in Zurich. "Sir, I don't like this. The address listed here, it belongs to a trust we flagged last year in a fraud case. The Swiss regulators shut it down, but the entity keeps popping up under new names." Graham's chest tightened. He had been so desperate to save his empire that he ignored every warning bell. The deal was no bridge. It was a noose, and it was Rosa's daughter, not his board or lawyers, who spotted the rope tightening. The phone on his desk lit again. Victor Marin's name glowed like a curse. Graham stared at it, his mind racing. Every fiber of his pride told him to pick it up to salvage what could be saved. But another voice echoed louder, now the memory of a teddy bear with a red ribbon tied too tight, the fear in Rosa's eyes, the warning in Mia's whisper. He let it ring. When it stopped, silence pressed down heavier than ever. Rosa's breathing was uneven. Mia was still watching him, unblinking. Graham finally exhaled and looked at Darren. "Cancel the transfer. Freeze everything tied to this deal. And keep this between us. If Kent asks, tell him nothing's changed." Darren nodded once, but his silence carried an unspoken truth if Kent was in on it. Graham's circle was already compromised. For the first time in decades, the billionaire who prided himself on being the smartest man in the room realized he had been the mark. He sat down heavily, his head in his hands. It wasn't humiliation that broke him. It was the knowledge that without Mia, he would have signed his ruin with his own pen. The glass walls of his office, once symbols of his power, now felt like transparent cages. Outside, the skyline of Chicago glittered with 1,000 lights, each one a reminder of how small even titans could be when darkness closed in. And at the center of it all, the smallest voice in the room had spoken the loudest truth. The storm did not arrive with thunder, but with the sharp click of polished shoes and the rustle of tailored suits. By mid-afternoon, Graham Locke's top-floor sanctuary inside the Willis Tower no longer belonged to him. Agents from the Financial Crimes Division poured through the glass doors, badges flashing their tone, brisk and cold. Computers were unplugged, files yanked from drawers. Assistants stood frozen, their faces pale, as their boss was named the target of a sweeping investigation. The empire he had built on fear now looked back at him with fear of its own. For the first time, Graham saw his employees' eyes not filled with obedience, but with the relief of seeing the king cornered. "Federal warrant," the lead agent announced. "Suspicion of laundering and tax fraud through international accounts. All materials will be seized." It was the perfect strike. Everything the shell companies and transfers suggested on paper now hung like a noose around Graham's neck. The very structure Victor Marin had built wasn't just a trap to steal his money. It had been designed to frame him as the criminal. From the corner, Darren Cole leaned closer and whispered, "This isn't random. Someone seeded this story weeks ago. They wanted you wearing the mask of their own crime." His voice was clipped professional, but Graham saw the steel flash in his eyes. Inside the private suite, a few floors below, Rosa Alvarez clutched her daughter, listening, as the rumble of heavy footsteps and the clang of file cabinets echoed through the walls. She had never imagined this kind of chaos in a skyscraper's halls. Every slam of a drawer upstairs sent her heart racing faster. She looked at Mia, who sat quietly on the edge of the sofa, her red ribbon wrapped tightly around her wrist like a talisman. Then came the knock. Loud, authoritative, the kind of sound that carried the weight of government power. Financial crimes. "Open the door." The voice outside was steady, commanding. Rosa gasped and instinctively pulled Mia behind her, whispering prayers under her breath. But Darren was already moving. He slipped into the suite, scanning the feed from hidden security monitors. "They don't have a warrant for this floor," he muttered. "They only have clearance for the corporate spaces. But if you stall them, they'll get one within the hour. And once they're in here, Rosa and Mia's presence will look like concealment of witnesses." The reality was brutal. To the outside world, Rosa and her daughter were not symbols of innocence. They would be spun into pawns, evidence of coercion leverage, to paint Graham as a man hiding the truth. The pounding on the door grew louder. Graham felt the walls of his world closing in. For years, he had defined strength as control, dominance, intimidation. Now, with Rosa trembling and Mia's small hand clutching his sleeve, he understood that strength was not what he thought it was. Strength meant choosing between his empire and the people who had nothing but him to rely on. "Is there another way out?" Graham demanded. Darren gave a short nod. "Service stairwell. Maintenance shaft runs parallel to the elevator core. It's not meant for executives, but it'll get us out." There was no time for hesitation. Graham reached for Rosa's arm. "Come." His voice for once was not an order but a plea. Rosa hesitated, torn between trust and terror, but Mia was already moving her tiny hand, slipping into Graham's without a word. That single gesture decided it. Rosa followed. They moved quickly through the polish suite into the service corridor. The shift was jarring. From marble and glass into concrete and steel, the guts of the skyscraper stretched before them. The air smelled of dust and machine oil, a world of shadows where the hum of generators drowned the chaos above. Darren took point. His movements precise, every step calculated. Behind them, the pounding on the suite door grew distant, muffled by layers of walls and pipes. Still, every sound, every creak of metal, every echo of their own footsteps felt like a flare giving away their escape. Rosa gripped Mia tightly, whispering for her to stay close. Graham stayed at their side, his once flawless suit brushing against rusted pipes and grimy walls. He didn't care. They descended flight after flight. On one landing, a locked grate barred their way. Panic flickered across Rosa's face. Darren knelt, pulling a tool from his pocket, forcing the latch until it popped with a metallic snap. Graham caught Mia before she stumbled on the uneven step, lifting her over the threshold. For a moment, she clung to him, her cheek pressed against his shirt. The billionaire who once ruled with silence felt his chest tighten in a way he had not known in years. When they finally emerged, it wasn't into polished lobbies or executive lounges, but onto a half-renovated office floor, empty, its windows covered with plastic sheeting. Dust swirled under the flickering light. They paused, catching their breath. The city outside still glittered indifferent to the drama inside its tallest tower. "We're clear for now," Darren said, though his tone carried no relief. "But they'll widen the search. Your accounts, your assets, everything will be frozen by morning." Graham pressed his hands against the window frame, staring at the streets below. In the reflection, he no longer looked like a titan. He looked like a man stripped bare. Rosa sank onto the dusty floor, still holding Mia. For her, the loss was even sharper. She had already received notice termination for breach of security. The only job that gave her dignity was gone, erased not by her mistakes, but by forces far larger. Her sobs filled the silent floor. Graham turned toward her, seeing not just an employee but a woman thrust into the line of fire, simply because fate had forced their lives to collide. He knelt, dust smudging the knees of his suit, and placed a hand on her shoulder. No words came, but in that gesture the weight of his guilt was clear. The skyscraper that had once crowned him king had become a prison, a trap, engineered by men who smiled as they set snares. And now, with the system turned against him, his only path to survival lay in the service corridors in the shadows, in the trust of a woman who feared him, and a child who saw through lies. Somewhere high above the pounding on the suite door finally gave way to silence. But Graham knew silence was no safety. It was only the pause before the next strike. The night had fallen heavy over Chicago, and in the small South Side house that had become their reluctant refuge, silence carried its own kind of weight. Graham Locke sat at the kitchen table, the glow of a single lamp throwing tired shadows across his face. Darren Cole spread out the files he had been digging through, fragments pulled from databases and whispers in back channels. Rosa Alvarez sat close by, still protective, while Mia drew quietly on a pad of paper. What the girl sketched wasn't flowers or stick figures, it was faces. Her small hand moved with purpose, pressing her pencil harder with every detail she remembered. Graham leaned closer, and when she turned the pad, the lines were unmistakable. A man's angular cheekbones, sharp eyes, the way his mouth curved when he spoke. "That's him," Mia said softly. "The one talking to Victor. The one who told him what to say." Darren studied the drawing with a grim nod. Orion. The name came out like a curse. He had heard it whispered among law enforcement circles, a ghostly figure who never touched the crime himself, but designed the hunt. He was the broker of human weakness, a man who sold profiles of people's vulnerabilities the way others sold stocks. No one had ever pinned him down. Until now. Graham stared at the child's drawing, his throat tightening. How had he, with all his lawyers and advisors, overlooked what a 5-year-old caught in passing had pieced together? His humiliation hardened into something colder. Resolve. "We stop running," he said. "We find him." Rosa's face drained of color. "Find him. Mr. Locke, you're talking about criminals who already threatened my child. We should go to the police. They framed me." Graham answered, his voice low, steady. "To the law, I'm the villain. Until we have proof, they'll never believe us." It was Darren who broke the silence. If Orion is really behind this, he won't be hiding in some tower. Men like him like control, and control means proximity. My contacts say he meets associates in a Riverside warehouse district. If we bait him, he might step out of the shadows. The plan was reckless, insane even, but every option left to them was dangerous. Graham understood the stakes. Without undeniable evidence, he would lose not only his company, but his freedom. Rosa and Mia would be left exposed. He chose madness over surrender. 2 days later, the sting was set. The riverfront air was sharp with the smell of rust and water. Graham stood in the cracked courtyard of a decaying warehouse, a place that once hummed with industry, but now lay forgotten. He wore a suit, though the lines of exhaustion had erased the authority it once carried. His breath hung visible in the early morning chill. A dark sedan rolled in, its headlights slicing across the concrete. From the passenger door stepped the man Mia had drawn the resemblance uncanny. Orion carried no weapon in his hand, yet the way he moved made the space his own. Calculated, elegant, a predator who knew he was in control. Mr. Locke, Orion called out, his voice carrying easily in the open air. "I must admit I'm surprised. Not many people walk willingly into the jaws of the trap." Graham forced his voice steady. "I came to make a deal. You've taken everything from me, but I can give you what you want her, the girl. In exchange, I walk away with my life intact." The words burned like acid in his throat. He hated himself for even pretending to barter with the life of the child who had saved him. But he knew Orion. Men like him believed in betrayal because betrayal was their language. Orion's thin smile widened. He stepped closer, his polished shoes crunching over gravel. "At last, you speak the truth. Every empire crumbles, Mr. Locke, and the men who built them will trade anything to survive. So where are they? The woman and child?" The sound of sirens cut through the air, sharp and escalating. Graham's stomach lurched. He hadn't called them. This wasn't part of the plan. Orion turned his head slightly, that same cold smile fixed on his face. "Ah, perfect timing. Did you think you were setting a trap?" "No, Mr. Locke. I set the stage. A meeting between a disgraced CEO and a criminal broker. Who do you think the police will believe, you, the man accused of laundering millions? Or me, the cooperative citizen reporting your attempt to blackmail me?" The blue and red lights flashed across the courtyard. Squad cars boxed in the exit. Officers spilled out weapons, drawn voices commanding. Graham's heart pounded. This was it. The net had been cast, and he was the fish flailing inside. "Arthur Locke, you're under arrest," the lead detective barked, his voice echoing. "Fraud, money, laundering, obstruction." Graham raised his hands, helpless. The cuffs closed around his wrists with a metallic click. Orion stood just feet away, his expression calm, his hands also raised in a mock gesture of surrender. He looked at Graham, his smile turning razor sharp. "I told you, every empire falls." And then came the voice that sliced through the chaos. Small, steady, and clear. "You're lying." The officers turned. Mia stood at the edge of the courtyard, Rosa behind her, both faces pale but resolute. The little girl held a phone in her hand, her eyes locked on the detective, not on Orion. "I took his picture," she said, lifting the phone high. "Him and the other man at the cafe in Lisbon. They had papers with my boss's name. I saw it. I knew it was wrong." The courtyard stilled. For a moment, the only sound was the river lapping against the concrete wall. The detective frowned, skeptical. A child's photo. But Darren emerged from the shadows, then stepping forward with a camera still recording. Not just a photo. "I've got video, him bragging. Every word since he stepped out of that car, including how he framed Mr. Locke." Orion's control cracked for the first time. His eyes flashed. His composure wavered. The officers shifted their glances, bouncing between the girl's trembling but steady hand and the evidence Darren displayed. The trap had snapped, but not on Graham. For the first time since this nightmare began, Graham saw the hunter's mask falter. Orion, the ghost. The mastermind was suddenly cornered by the smallest witness in the room. And the balance of power shifted. The weeks that followed the riverside sting unraveled like a slow-motion storm. Victor Marin vanished overseas, his accounts frozen and his name splashed across international warrants. Harold Kent, the trusted lawyer who had betrayed Graham, folded under pressure and confessed to his role trading secrets for leniency. And Orion, the shadow architect who thought himself untouchable, was paraded in handcuffs through a courthouse, his arrogance finally cracked. The empire of deceit collapsed piece by piece, and for the first time, Graham Locke was not the man under siege. Yet victory felt hollow. His company, though spared from financial collapse, was battered by scandal. Shareholders muttered, board members plotted, and the media painted him alternately as a victim and as a fool. None of that mattered. What lingered most was not the fight he had won, but the image of Rosa and Mia standing in that courtyard, small figures against the floodlights saving him in the moment he thought he was lost. One evening, weeks after the headlines had cooled, Graham found himself driving without a destination. He turned corners aimlessly until he stopped in front of a modest apartment block on the south side. It was Rosa's temporary housing arranged quietly after the storm. He sat in the car for a long time, staring at the stairwell light flickering above the entrance, wondering if he belonged anywhere near their lives after what they had endured because of him. Finally, he climbed the steps and knocked. Rosa opened the door, surprise flashing across her tired features. She did not speak at first. She only looked at him with guarded eyes, waiting for the version of Graham Locke she would face: the cold tycoon, the disgraced CEO, or the man who had sat in dust beside her when everything fell apart. "I came to talk," he said simply. His voice lacked the commanding edge it once carried. Inside, the apartment was small but warm. The scent of cooking filled the air. Mia was at the kitchen table, bent over homework, her red ribbon tied into her hair. When she saw Graham, she smiled, not the tentative smile of a child facing power, but something genuine, something that reached him in a place no accolade ever had. He sat across from them, his large frame awkward, in the small kitchen. For a moment, he stared at his hands, searching for words. "I've spent my whole life building things," he began. "Towers, companies, numbers on screens. I thought that was power. But when it all cracked, it wasn't my lawyers or my board who saved me. It was you and her." He nodded toward Mia. Rosa's eyes softened, but she did not release him from her silence. She wanted truth, not speeches. Graham drew in a slow breath. "I can't go back to the man I was, and I don't want to. What I want is a life where the people who stood beside me when I had nothing left stay beside me, not as employees, as family." The word hung in the air, fragile and daring. Rosa blinked, and for the first time since he had met her, he saw her eyes glisten, not from fear or exhaustion, but from something else she had buried for too long: hope. Mia closed her notebook and walked over to him. She did not say a word. She simply climbed onto his lap, wrapped her small arms around his neck, and whispered into his ear, "May I give you a hug?" It was the same line that had echoed in his mind since the day she first picked up his phone. Only this time he didn't hear it as a threat to his order, but as a gift. His arms tightened around her, and in that embrace something shifted deep within him. For decades he had been a man feared by hundreds, respected by rivals, envied by strangers. But in that small apartment with a child's arms around him, and Rosa's quiet tears glistening in the lamplight, Graham Locke finally understood what it meant to be human. Months later, the top floor of the Willis Tower looked nothing like it once had. Gone were the heavy drapes that choked the light. The mahogany bar, once stocked to impress clients, had been replaced with shelves of children's books and bright drawings taped to the glass walls. On the desk, where Graham once signed billion-dollar contracts, a dinosaur-shaped pencil holder sat beside a framed picture: 3 stick figures holding hands under the Chicago skyline. The Locke Shield Foundation had become the heart of his rebuilt empire. Its mission was simple but vital: teaching small business owners how to recognize the signs of financial predators. Graham funded it with his own money, but Rosa ran it with empathy and resolve. Her ability to connect with people who had been dismissed or tricked made the work real. And Mia, never far from her mother, became the foundation's quiet symbol, the child who once saw what the adults missed. One Friday afternoon, as the city pulsed outside, Graham sat at his desk, not staring at stock tickers, but leaning over Mia's math homework. Long division puzzled him more than a 100-page contract ever had, and he laughed at his own frustration. Rosa entered with a tray coffee for him, juice for her daughter, and watched the scene with a warmth she never thought possible. The desk phone rang. Once that sound had nearly been his undoing. Now he answered it calmly. "Locke Shield Foundation. How can we help?" On the other end, a nervous voice spilled out a story that sounded all too familiar. A stranger offering an investment too good to be true, paperwork already in motion. Graham listened, patient, steady. When the caller finished, he said words that had become his creed. "Don't worry, you're not alone. We'll walk through this together and show you what's hiding in the shadows. When he hung up, his eyes met Mia's. She gave him a knowing smile, the kind only a child with an old soul could give. In her gaze, Graham saw not the empire he had nearly lost, but the family he had found. And he knew, with a clarity sharper than any balance sheet, that this was the only victory that had ever truly mattered. Graham Locke's story is not simply one of wealth, downfall, and redemption. It is the story of how a man who once believed he was untouchable came to understand the true foundations of strength. From the heights of the Willis Tower, Graham lived as if he were above the world. His employees feared him, his rivals envied him, and his pride convinced him that discipline and control would shield him from disaster. But everything he had built teetered on the edge of collapse, and the one person who stopped him from losing it all was the last person he would have expected, a little girl who had no power, no title, and no reason to be in his office except fate placed her there. When Mia answered his phone, it seemed like an act of defiance, a child's mistake that risked everything. Instead, it revealed the truth that his arrogance had blinded him to the deal that promised salvation for his company was nothing more than a snare. Victor Marin's smooth words were bait, and behind him stood Orion, a predator who designed cons so perfect they left victims believing they had destroyed themselves. The man who prided himself on being the smartest in every room nearly became just another mark. And it was a child's voice unafraid to name what she saw that exposed the danger. The fall that followed was swift and brutal. Graham's office rated his reputation, shredded by allegations of laundering and fraud, his wealth tied up in frozen accounts. He was no longer the king of his empire, but the quarry in someone else's hunt. Yet, in those desperate hours, something remarkable happened. Rosa, the woman who scrubbed his floors, and Mia, the child who had once seemed a nuisance, became his only anchors. Darren, his head of security, stood by him when others abandoned him. In their presence, Graham discovered a strength that no money could buy: loyalty, courage, and the will to fight not for power but for each other. The showdown at the riverside brought everything into sharp focus. Orion believed he had written the final chapter, painting Graham as the villain, while he stood untouchable. But what Orion underestimated was the same thing Graham had once ignored: the smallest voice in the room. Mia's courage in presenting evidence paired with Darren's recorded proof shattered the web of lies. The trap closed not around Graham but around the predator himself. In that moment, the lesson crystallized: arrogance blinds, but humility sees. What came after was not simply vindication, but rebirth. The Willis Tower, once a monument to Graham's ego, became the headquarters of the Locke Shield Foundation, an organization devoted to protecting small business owners from the very traps he nearly fell into. Rosa's empathy and resilience guided its work. Mia became the face of its mission, a living reminder that wisdom is not always measured in age or status, but in honesty and courage. And Graham, the man who once demanded fear, learned that true leadership was not about control, but about protecting and uplifting others. So, what do we take from Graham Locke's story? The lesson is universal, true. Power is not found in wealth, control, or fear. It is found in humility and courage, and in the willingness to listen. In our lives, we are surrounded by promises, opportunities, and voices telling us what we want to hear. Sometimes, the truth comes from where we least expect it, from a spouse, a colleague, a friend, even a child. The question is, are we willing to hear it? Graham's story challenges us to pause, to question, and to value people not for their status, but for their sincerity. If Graham Locke, a man once blinded by arrogance, could be saved and transformed by a child's hug, then so can we learn to see the truth in the voices we too often overlook. If this story inspired you, gave you hope, or reminded you of what truly matters, I encourage you to subscribe to this channel. Your support gives us the motivation to continue creating stories that not only entertain, but also leave you with lessons to carry into your own life. Subscribe now and join us for the next story that just might change the way you see the world.